cargo ship that docked in Oakland 3 days ago wasn't carrying what the manifest said, or maybe it was, I don't know anymore. But what I do know is that by 10:30 this morning, dock workers at the port started attacking each other. And I mean actually attacking, ripping and biting. And the news helicopters got there first, broadcasting live before anyone understood what they were seeing. I had the police scanner running in my studio like I always do, background noise mostly. But around 11:15, the chatter went from routine to panicked in about 90 seconds. Units responding to Terminal 6 were calling for backup, then calling for SWAT, then just screaming into their radios about people covered in something that looked like mold or fungus, people who wouldn't stay down even after being shot. Channel 7's helicopter pilot kept circling lower and lower, trying to get footage until his camera operator started shouting that something was wrong with the pilot, that he was scratching at his face, that there were things growing out of his skin, and then the feed cut to static right before the helicopter hit a warehouse roof. I recorded all of it, every second, because that's what I do, I document things. But I didn't understand what I was documenting until the CDC scientist came on every channel at noon. His name was Marcus Denvers, and he looked like someone who hadn't slept in 2 days, standing at a podium with federal agents behind him. And he said we were dealing with an airborne fungal pathogen that attacks the central nervous system. He used words like unprecedented and catastrophic transmission rate, said respiratory exposure leads to colonization within hours, that infected individuals lose motor control as the organism spreads through neural tissue. And he said all of this in the flattest voice I've ever heard, like he was reading a grocery list instead of describing the end of human civilization. The questions from reporters lasted maybe 3 minutes before people in the crowd started shoving each other trying to get out. And I watched on the studio monitor as the press conference dissolved into chaos, with Marcus Denvers just standing there at the podium, not moving, while people trampled each other behind him. My broadcast partner, Dylan Mercer, called me from his apartment in Alameda, saying he could see infected people in the street below, said they moved wrong, all jerky and uncoordinated, like their bodies didn't quite belong to them anymore. And he was trying to decide if he should make a run for his car or barricade himself inside. I told him to stay put, that I'd come get him once things calmed down, and he laughed at that, said things weren't going to calm down. Said he could see what looked like white fungal growth covering the walls of the building across from his, spreading faster than seemed possible for any living organism. That was the last time I spoke to Dylan, because by 3 o'clock cell networks were overloaded and landlines were going down. And I was alone in the studio watching civilization collapse in real time through a combination of news feeds and my own windows. The military showed up around 4, helicopters and transport trucks, soldiers in hazmat gear establishing checkpoints on every major road, and they were turning people back, forcing everyone to stay in the Bay Area. And I understood then that they weren't trying to save us, they were trying to contain us. I could see the checkpoint on University Avenue from my roof, watched them shoot a man who tried to ram through the barricade in a pickup truck, watched the truck burn with him still inside, while hundreds of people who'd been trying to escape just stood there, realizing they were trapped. The thing about working in radio is you develop this instinct for when a story is bigger than your equipment can handle, when you need to move or lose everything. And I got that feeling around 6 in the evening when the power grid started failing in sections. I grabbed my portable transmitter, my laptop, every battery pack I owned, loaded it all into my Honda and started driving east into the hills. The streets were emptier than I expected. Most people either barricaded inside their homes or already dead or transformed. And I saw my first infected up close when I stopped at an intersection in Piedmont. She'd been a woman once, maybe 40 years old, wearing a business suit that was torn and stained, but the fungus had already consumed most of her face, white threads growing out of her eyes and mouth, and she turned toward my car when she heard the engine. Her movements were all wrong. Arms bending at angles that shouldn't be possible, legs dragging like she'd forgotten how to use them properly, and I could hear this sound coming from her throat, not words, just this wet clicking noise that made my skin crawl. I drove through the intersection doing maybe 60 miles per hour and didn't look back, kept climbing into the Berkeley Hills until I found an overlook with cell tower access where I could set up my equipment. By nightfall, I had the portable transmitter running on battery power, and I was broadcasting to whoever could still receive, describing what I was seeing spread out below me. Oakland was burning in at least a dozen places, fires going unchecked because there was nobody left to fight them. San Francisco was dark, except for spotlights from military positions on Treasure Island and the Presidio. The Bay Bridge had lines of vehicles stopped bumper to bumper, with people walking between them, and even from 5 miles away, I could see bodies in the road, could see movement that didn't look human anymore, spreading through the crowd. The worst part wasn't the violence or the fires or the screaming that carried on the wind. It was how fast the fungus worked once it took hold. I set up a camera with a telephoto lens pointed at a residential street in North Oakland and recorded what happened to a group of maybe 20 people who'd barricaded themselves in a church. They looked safe at first, had the doors reinforced, were organized enough to post lookouts, but one of them must have already been infected before they sealed themselves in, because around 9:30, I saw them smash out a window from the inside. The infected one came out first, stumbling and jerking, and then the others followed. But they were running, trying to get away from something, and within 2 hours, every single one of them was wandering that street with fungal growth erupting from their heads and backs and chests. I've been broadcasting non-stop since then, running on coffee and adrenaline, watching the end of the world through camera lenses and police scanners. It's day 3 now, and the infected aren't just wandering anymore. Some of them have stopped moving entirely, rooted in place, while massive fungal structures grow out of their bodies. I watched one of them form over the course of 18 hours, the host body gradually disappearing under layers of white and gray fungal mass that grew upward like some obscene tree, reaching maybe 12 feet high before it split open at the top and released this cloud of spores that caught the morning light like dust particles. The cloud drifted on the wind, and I could track it moving downhill toward residential neighborhoods. And I thought about all those people hiding in their basements, thinking walls would protect them from something they can't even see. The military tried something yesterday, sent jets over downtown Oakland and dropped incendiary bombs on the densest infected zones. And for maybe an hour, I thought it might actually work. Watched entire blocks go up in flames hot enough that nothing could survive. But the fires burned out or got contained to specific areas, and by evening I could see movement in the burned zones again. Infected that had been on the edges shambling into the cleared spaces, and more of those spore towers growing where buildings used to stand. There's no central command anymore, no coordinated response, just scattered units trying to maintain perimeters that keep shrinking as more soldiers get infected or abandon their posts. I'm leaving the studio in an hour, heading north toward Napa, toward wine country, where the population density is lower and maybe the infection hasn't spread as completely. I can't stay here. The infected are moving uphill now, following sound or heat or something, and my position isn't defensible. This is Ethan Calloway, still transmitting, and if you're hearing this, you need to get to high ground, get to cold places, avoid enclosed spaces where spores can concentrate. Wear respiratory protection, don't trust anyone showing symptoms, and understand that the people you love might already be gone, even if they're still walking around. I'm signing off from Berkeley Hills for the last time, packing my equipment while I watch Oakland burn itself out below me. The smoke is thick enough now that I can barely see the bay, can barely make out the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance, and I wonder if anyone made it across before the military blew the span. I wonder if anywhere is still safe, or if this fungus is spreading faster than humans can run. I wonder a lot of things, but mostly I wonder if anyone's actually listening to this broadcast, or if I'm just talking to ghosts and empty air. Either way, I'll keep transmitting, keep moving, keep surviving as long as I can, because that's all any of us can do now. Stay safe out there, stay human, and I'll find you on the other side of whatever this becomes. This is Ethan Calloway, and I'm broadcasting from Napa Valley, from what used to be a wine estate up in the hills where someone with too much money built a house they probably visited twice a year. The silence up here is worse than the chaos was in Oakland. I've made contact with maybe a dozen other survivors over shortwave radio, people scattered across Northern California and into Oregon, and we're sharing information, trying to piece together what this thing actually is and how it works. There's a forest ranger named Jonah Whitfield broadcasting from somewhere in the Shasta Trinity area. Says he's been documenting the fungal spread through the wilderness, and it's not just affecting humans anymore. He described finding a black bear 2 days ago that had been colonized, said the animal was still moving, but covered in the same white fungal threads we're seeing on infected people, and the organism had completely altered its behavior. The bear wasn't hunting or foraging, just wandering in circles near a stream until it eventually stopped moving and started growing one of those spore towers. Jonah thinks the fungus is opportunistic, that it'll colonize any warm-blooded host it can reach, and he's been tracking its spread across the forest floor where it's consuming dead organic matter and leaf litter, creating these dense fungal mats that look like snow from a distance. I met someone yesterday who changed how I understand this whole situation. A microbiologist named Carter Langston, who was working at a biotech facility in South San Francisco when everything collapsed. He made it out with some equipment and samples, been hiding in a winery processing facility about 3 miles down the valley from my position, trying to study the fungus under a microscope he powered with a car battery. Carter reached out over CB radio asking if anyone had medical training or lab experience, and when I showed up, he was wearing a full hazmat suit, even though we were meeting outside, wouldn't let me near his workspace without respiratory protection. He explained that he'd collected specimens from multiple infected hosts, and what he found was terrifying in its elegance. The organism organism is called Cordyceps, same genus that infects insects in tropical regions. But this strain has adapted to mammalian hosts in ways that shouldn't be possible through natural evolution. Carter said it targets the brainstem first, sends fungal threads through the spinal cord and into the motor cortex, hijacking movement while leaving parts of consciousness intact during early stages. He'd been documenting the progression in an infected woman he'd found restrained in a crashed ambulance, kept her sedated and under observation for the first 36 hours of colonization. According to his notes, she remained aware enough to mouth words to show recognition when he spoke to her, but her body wouldn't respond to her commands. The fungus was controlling her muscular system while her mind was still trapped inside, watching herself transform. By hour 48, the fungal threads had penetrated deep enough into her brain that higher cognitive functions ceased entirely, and that's when the behavior changed from confused thrashing to purposeful movement. The body became a vehicle for fungal reproduction, driven by chemical signals to seek out dark, humid environments optimal for spore production. Carter said the infected woman broke her restraints with strength that shouldn't have been possible given her body mass, that the fungus was somehow enhancing muscular performance even as it consumed neural tissue. He had to terminate the experiment when fungal growth burst through her skull, and he realized spores were beginning to form. He burned her body in a barrel outside the lab, said watching her burn was the hardest thing he'd ever done, because part of him wondered if some fragment of her was still conscious inside that fungal prison. Carter walked me through the infection mechanism using diagrams he'd sketched in a notebook, explaining how the spores enter through respiratory passages and germinate in the warm, moist environment of the lungs. The fungal threads grow rapidly, spreading through the bloodstream and lymphatic system, crossing the blood-brain barrier within 12 to 18 hours of exposure. Once it reaches neural tissue, it begins producing enzymes that break down cellular structures while simultaneously creating new fungal networks that interface with existing nervous system pathways. The colonization is irreversible after the 48-hour mark. By then, the fungus has integrated so deeply into brain tissue that killing it would kill the host, except the host is already functionally dead, just a biological machine operating on fungal autopilot. He showed me growth rate calculations that made my stomach drop, mathematical projections of how fast this organism could spread under optimal conditions. Based on his specimens and field observations, Carter estimated that each mature spore tower releases approximately 5 million viable spores over a 3-day period, and those spores can remain airborne for hours depending on wind conditions, can travel dozens of miles before settling. A single infected person who reaches the sporulation stage can potentially expose thousands of others if they root in a populated area. Multiply that across the hundreds of thousands who were infected in those first few days, and you get a cascading outbreak that overwhelms any containment effort. The Bay Area alone probably produced enough spores to blanket the Central Valley, and wind patterns would carry them east toward the Sierras and north into Oregon and Washington. I've been monitoring radio traffic from military channels I probably shouldn't be able to access, listening to encrypted communications between units that are barely holding their perimeters. Sacramento fell completely 3 days ago. The state government evacuated to some secure location they won't identify over open channels. San Francisco is a dead zone. They're not even attempting to hold it anymore, just maintaining a containment line along the peninsula to keep infected from spreading south. Reno is reporting cases, which means spores crossed the Sierra Nevada faster than anyone thought possible. Las Vegas put the entire city under quarantine, but I heard broadcasts yesterday from people trapped inside saying infected are already moving through the streets downtown, that the casinos have become tombs filled with thousands of bodies in various stages of transformation. Carter and I spent most of yesterday afternoon discussing adaptation patterns, how quickly this organism is evolving to maximize its success in human hosts. He collected samples from infected at different stages over the past week and noticed distinct generational improvements in neural colonization efficiency. The first infected took nearly 60 hours to reach full motor control loss, but specimens from day 8 were showing complete colonization in 40 hours, and the fungal structures were growing denser and more robust with each iteration. Carter said at this rate of adaptation, within 6 months, we'd be dealing with a strain that's perfectly optimized for human infection, something that could colonize a host in 24 hours and produce viable spores in half the current time frame. I asked him what we do with that information, how it helps us survive, and he got quiet for a long time before admitting he didn't know. He said he was documenting the science because someone needed to understand what killed humanity. Someone needed to leave a record for whatever comes after. But he didn't think there was a cure or a treatment or even an effective long-term defense. Antifungal medications could slow early-stage infections, but they'd burn through the available pharmaceutical supplies in the first week, and manufacturing more required industrial infrastructure that no longer existed. The only real defense was avoiding exposure, staying away from infected, staying away from spore clouds, and eventually running out of places to hide as the fungus established permanent presence across the entire landscape. On day 12, I went back to check on Carter because he'd missed our scheduled radio contact. I found him in the winery lab, sitting on the floor with his back against a wall, and I knew before I got close enough to see clearly. The fungal threads were growing out of his eyes and ears, white filaments that moved slightly in the air currents from the ventilation system he'd rigged up. His notebook was open on the table next to him, and the last entry said he'd been infected approximately 36 hours earlier, probably from a containment breach with one of his specimens. He documented his own progression with clinical precision, describing the initial respiratory symptoms, the fever, the moment when he felt the first tendrils pushing into his brain tissue. His final written words were an apology to anyone who found him and instructions to burn everything in the lab, including his body. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes just looking at him, watching the fungal growth spread across his skin in real time, watching his chest rise and fall with automated breathing that had nothing to do with consciousness anymore. Carter had been trying to save us, trying to understand the thing that was killing us, and it got him anyway. I followed his instructions, gathered all his research notes and samples, soaked everything in wine from the barrels stacked in the adjoining room, and lit it all on fire. The winery burned for 3 hours, smoke rising into the clear autumn sky, and I broadcasted the whole thing, explained what Carter had discovered and what it meant for anyone still listening. The temperature has been dropping at night, getting down into the 40s, and I've noticed the infected moving slower when it gets cold. Jonah confirmed it from his position up north, says the fungus is temperature sensitive, that sustained cold slows its growth rate and reduces spore production. That means winter is our ally. Means we have maybe 2 or 3 months before spring temperatures return, and this whole cycle accelerates again. I'm planning to move higher into the mountains, up into the Cascades, where elevation and cold might buy me enough time to figure out what comes next. I've been in contact with other survivors heading in the same direction, and we're sharing coordinates of potential safe zones, places above 6,000 feet where the snow stays on the ground through April. This is day 21, and I'm packing up the estate, loading everything I can carry into the Honda, preparing to drive north through back roads and fire trails. The valley below is completely overrun now. The fungal mat spreading across the landscape like a second winter arriving early. I can see infected moving between the towers, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their bodies bent and broken, but still mobile, still driven by the organism that's puppeting their remains. There's no one left to save down there, no rescue coming, no miracle cure being developed in some secret laboratory. There's just survival, just movement, just the slim hope that somewhere far enough away or high enough up, we might find a place where this fungus can't follow. I'm heading into the mountains, and I'll keep broadcasting as long as I have power, as long as I'm still breathing. Because Carter was right about one thing. Someone needs to document this. Someone needs to remember what we were before the fungus turned us into fertilizer for its reproduction cycle. This is Ethan Calloway broadcasting from somewhere in the southern Cascade Range. I'm not giving exact coordinates because I've learned that's a bad idea, that there are people out here who will come looking for supplies or equipment or just company they can exploit. It's day 22, and I've been on the road for about 18 hours, driving through backcountry roads that barely qualify as roads, avoiding the interstate because that's where the dead vehicles are stacked 3 deep and the infected congregate in the tunnels and overpasses. The landscape up here is different from the valley, colder and quieter, and the fungal presence is less dense, but it's still here, still spreading. Those white mats creeping across the forest floor between the trees, climbing up bark and covering fallen logs like snow that never melts. I passed through what used to be a logging town yesterday, maybe 30 buildings total, and the entire place was a graveyard. Someone had tried to organize a defense. You could see the barricades made from lumber and overturned trucks, see the defensive positions they'd set up around a general store, but it hadn't been enough. Bodies were scattered in the street in various stages of decomposition and fungal colonization, some of them still recognizable as human, others transformed into those grotesque spore towers that rise like monuments to our extinction. I counted at least a dozen towers in that small town, which means dozens more infected wandering somewhere in the surrounding forest. And I didn't stick around long enough to find out where. The infected move differently up here in the cold, slower, and more mechanical, like their joints are stiffening in the lower temperatures. I watched 3 of them cross the road about a mile back, stumbling through the tree line with fungal growth covering most of their upper bodies, and they didn't even turn toward my car when I drove past. The organism seems less active in hosts when the ambient temperature drops below 45 degrees. Their movements become sluggish and uncoordinated, and I haven't seen any active sporulation in the cold zones. That doesn't mean they're dead or harmless, just dormant, waiting for conditions to improve. And I know that when spring comes, this whole region, will explode with spore production. I made contact yesterday with a group calling themselves Haven 7, broadcasting from somewhere in the mountains west of Mount Shasta. They claim to have a secure compound with 20 people, sustainable food production, and screening protocols that kept them infection-free. The voice on the radio belonged to someone named Mason Drayton, former military contractor, and he spoke with the kind of confidence that made me want to believe him. He gave me coordinates and an invitation, said they were accepting survivors who could contribute skills or labor, and I drove through the night to reach their position because the idea of being around other people again, of having walls and security and community, that was worth the risk. I reached their compound around dawn on day 24 and immediately understood this wasn't a sanctuary. It was a prison with voluntary inmates. They'd built it in a cleared section of forest, maybe 5 acres, surrounded by a wall constructed from shipping containers and lumber, with watchtowers at the corners and guards carrying hunting rifles. Mason met me at the gate, wearing a respirator and rubber gloves, wouldn't let me inside until I'd stripped down to my underwear in the freezing morning air, while he and 2 others examined every inch of my skin for fungal growth. They searched my car, confiscated half my supplies as an entry fee, and only then did they allow me through the inner gate where the rest of the compound residents were gathered to inspect the new arrival. The place operated on fear and rigid hierarchy, Mason at the top making all decisions, everyone else following orders without question, because the alternative was exile into the infected wilderness. They had protocols for everything: when you could go outside the walls, how long you could be exposed to open air, mandatory twice daily skin inspections where everyone stripped naked in a communal building while designated inspectors looked for any signs of infection. I met people who'd been there since day 8, who'd watched the compound evolve from a cooperative survival effort into something closer to a dictatorship. And they spoke in whispers about the executions, about people who'd been exiled for minor protocol violations or suspicion of exposure. There were 2 brothers there, teenagers named Ryan and Mitchell, and they'd been at the compound for 6 days. I talked with them during evening meal, which was a thin vegetable soup served in a mess hall built from plywood and corrugated metal, and they told me their story in fragments between watching other people eat. Their family had been camping near Lassen Peak when the outbreak started, 3 days into a week-long trip that was supposed to be their last vacation before the older brother started college. Their father was Derek, high school chemistry teacher, and their mother was a dental hygienist, whose name they could barely say without their voices breaking. They tried to return home to Sacramento when news broke about the outbreak, but the roads were already impossible, choked with abandoned vehicles and panicked crowds. Derek made the decision to head deeper into the wilderness instead of trying to fight through the chaos, figured they could wait it out in the mountains until authorities got the situation under control. They spent 2 weeks camping and moving between locations, listening to radio broadcasts that got progressively more desperate and less frequent, watching the smoke rise from distant cities, and believing they were safe because they were isolated and careful. Ryan told me about the morning they woke up and found their father sitting by the dead campfire, just sitting there staring at his hands. And when they asked if he was okay, he said he felt strange, said his head hurt and his vision was blurry. Within 6 hours, Derek was running a fever and complaining about pressure behind his eyes, and their mother was trying to comfort him while clearly panicking, checking his temperature every 20 minutes and going through their medical supplies looking for something that would help. By nightfall, Derek couldn't walk straight, kept stumbling and falling, and when Mitchell tried to help him up, he noticed the small white threads growing from his father's ears. Their mother made them leave, told them to take the supplies and run while she stayed with Derek, and both boys refused until she started screaming at them that she might already be infected from close contact, that they needed to go immediately or they'd all die together. Ryan described hearing his father's voice calling after them as they ran through the dark forest, except it wasn't really his father's voice anymore. It was something using his father's vocal cords to make sounds that approximated speech. And that was 3 weeks ago, but Ryan said he still heard it sometimes when he was trying to sleep. They'd found the compound by following Mason's radio broadcasts, got taken in because they were young and strong and could work, but Mitchell told me quietly that he didn't think they'd made the right choice. He'd watched Mason exile a woman 2 days earlier because she had a cough, just a regular cold weather cough, but Mason didn't take chances. He'd had her escorted outside the walls and locked the gate behind her, and they could hear her begging to be let back in for maybe an hour before she gave up and walked off into the forest. Mitchell said the compound was surviving, but it wasn't living, that they'd sacrificed their humanity for the illusion of security, and he was starting to think dying human was better than surviving as something less. I spent 3 days at Haven 7, broadcasting from their compound, documenting their protocols and interviewing residents who were willing to talk. Most of them were terrified, not just of the infection, but of each other, of being reported for suspicious behavior or showing signs of illness. Mason ran the place through paranoia and collective punishment. If someone violated protocol, everyone's rations got cut. If someone questioned his authority, they got assigned to extra guard duty in the cold. And the entire social structure depended on everyone being too afraid to resist. On day 27, there was an incident that showed me exactly how fragile this whole arrangement was. One of the storage sheds had a breach, probably from a rotted board or a gap in the ceiling, and when someone opened the door to retrieve supplies, a visible spore cloud drifted out into the compound yard. 7 people were in the immediate area, got exposed before anyone realized what was happening, and Mason's response was instantaneous and brutal. He had them restrained, zip-tied their hands behind their backs, and marched them out the front gate at gunpoint while they pleaded and cried and explained they'd been following protocol, that it was an accident, that they deserved a chance. He left them outside the walls, gave each of them a knife and a canteen of water, and told them they had 48 hours to prove they weren't infected before the compound would consider taking them back. I watched from one of the guard towers as those 7 people huddled together about 50 yards from the gate, watching the compound that had just exiled them, and I knew none of them were coming back, even if they stayed symptom-free. Mason had made his decision, and admitting he was wrong would undermine his authority, would make people question whether his other decisions were correct, and the compound's entire stability depended on everyone believing Mason knew what he was doing. That night, I could hear them calling out updates, saying they felt fine, saying the exposure had been minimal, asking to please be let back in, and by morning their voices were hoarse from shouting into silence. On the 3rd night at the compound, I helped Ryan and Mitchell load their gear, and we left before dawn through a gap in the perimeter they'd discovered during their guard shifts. We took my car and some supplies we'd managed to hide from the inventory, drove away while the compound was still sleeping, and I felt lighter the moment we cleared their territory. Ryan asked where we were going, and I told him higher, further into the Cascades, up, where the elevation and cold would keep infected activity minimal through the winter. Mitchell wanted to know what we'd do when spring came and the fungus woke up again, and I didn't have an answer for that, except we'd be alive to face the problem, which was more than most people could say. This is day 34, and we're camped at a fire lookout tower near Crater Lake, elevation just over 7,000 feet, with snow already on the ground and temperatures dropping below freezing at night. The infected can't function in sustained cold. We've confirmed that by observation, watching them slow to immobility when temperatures hit the low 30s and remain there for more than a few hours. Up here we're safe until spring thaw, which gives us maybe 3 or 4 months to prepare for whatever comes next. I'm broadcasting with Ryan and Mitchell sleeping in the tower behind me, two kids who watched their parents transform and still managed to keep moving forward, and I figure if they can survive this, then maybe the rest of us can too. The world ended 4 weeks ago, but we're still here, still breathing, still fighting, and that has to count for something, even if I'm not sure what. This is Ethan Calloway, and I'm broadcasting from the Crater Lake Fire Lookout on day 35, and I need to tell you that winter arrived hard last night. We got 8 inches of snow in 6 hours, temperature dropped to 22 degrees, and when I looked out at the landscape this morning, the entire world was white and still and silent in a way that felt almost peaceful if you could forget what's buried under all that snow. The infected that were moving through the lower elevations 2 days ago have gone completely dormant. We haven't seen mobile activity since the temperature stabilized below freezing. And for the first time since this started, I can breathe without checking over my shoulder every 30 seconds. Ryan and Mitchell have adapted to tower life faster than I expected. Maybe because they spent those weeks camping with their family before everything fell apart. Or maybe because teenagers are just more resilient than we give them credit for. Ryan has taken over inventory management, organized our food supplies by caloric density and expiration dates, calculated that we have enough to last until late February if we're disciplined about rationing. Mitchell appointed himself security, does perimeter checks twice daily, marks infected positions on a map he's building of the surrounding area. We found 17 dormant infected within a half-mile radius of the tower, most of them locked in place by the cold, covered in snow, looking like twisted statues in a sculpture garden designed by someone with a sick sense of humor. I've been making contact with other survivor groups across a wider range than before. My signal reaches further in the cold, dry air, and the picture I'm putting together is grim, but not hopeless. The West Coast is functionally lost. Every major city from San Diego to Seattle is a fungal zone, with only scattered survivor pockets in the outlying areas. But the Rockies are holding. The mountain states bought themselves time with elevation and early winter, and there are communities forming in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, places where the snow came early enough to halt the initial outbreak spread. They're fortifying, planning for spring, trying to establish something sustainable before the thaw brings the fungus back to active status. I made contact 3 days ago with a biologist named Colton Reeves, who's operating out of a research station somewhere in the northern Cascades. He's been studying the fungal spread patterns with actual scientific equipment, tracking growth rates and environmental factors, and what he's learned confirms our worst suspicions while also giving us some tactical advantages. Colton explained that the fungus isn't just killing humans, it's fundamentally altering the ecosystem it invades. The mycelial networks it creates underground are connecting across vast distances, not with consciousness or intelligence, but through chemical signaling and resource sharing that mimics how natural fungal networks operate in healthy forests. The organism is consuming dead organic matter at an accelerated rate, breaking down everything from fallen leaves to human corpses, converting it all into nutrients that feed the larger fungal structure. Colton said in areas where the infection has been established for a month or more, soil chemistry has already changed, pH levels shifting, nitrogen content increasing, creating conditions that favor fungal growth while making it harder for native plants to survive. He's projecting that within 5 years, the entire infected region will have soil composition more similar to tropical rainforest floors than temperate zones. And the plant species that can thrive in those conditions won't be the ones that grew here before. What that means practically is we're not fighting to reclaim lost territory. We're fighting to prevent total ecological transformation of the continent. Every acre the fungus establishes becomes permanently altered terrain that will require generations to restore, even if we somehow eliminated every trace of the organism. Colton believes the only realistic strategy is containment at defensible geographical boundaries, using the Rockies as a natural fire break, holding the line through winter when the fungus is dormant, and preparing for annual defensive operations every spring when temperatures rise and infection risk returns. He's been coordinating with military remnants who've established a command structure in Cheyenne, sharing his research and getting tactical support in return. The military lost most of its West Coast infrastructure in the first 2 weeks, but they maintained fallback positions in the interior, and they're reorganizing around a defensive doctrine instead of offensive containment. Colton said the current plan is to establish a buffer zone along the eastern Rockies, monitor for fungal spread, and maintain survivor communities at high elevation where year-round cold provides natural protection. It's not victory, but it's survival, which is more than anyone expected 6 weeks ago. I asked Colton about cure research, about whether anyone was working on treatments or vaccines, and he was quiet for a long time before answering. He said there were scientists trying, facilities in secure locations with preserved samples and equipment, but the fundamental problem is the fungus integrates too deeply into host neural tissue. By the time symptoms appear, the colonization is already advanced enough that killing the fungus would kill the host, and preventing infection requires avoiding spore exposure entirely. Antifungal medications can slow progression if administered within hours of exposure, but production and distribution infrastructure no longer exists for widespread treatment. The honest answer is, we're not getting our old world back. We're building something new in the spaces the fungus can't reach. Ryan asked me last night what I thought happens to the people who got infected, if there's anything left of them inside those fungal puppets, and I told him what Carter had documented before he died. That consciousness persists for maybe 48 hours while the fungus establishes motor control, that there's probably awareness during that transition, trapped and helpless while your body stops belonging to you. After neural integration completes, there's nothing left that could be called human, just biological automation serving fungal reproduction. Ryan wanted to know if his father suffered, if there was a moment when Derek understood what was happening to him. And I said honestly I didn't know, that maybe the fever and neural degradation created enough confusion that there wasn't clear awareness, that maybe it was more like falling asleep than experiencing horror. Mitchell hasn't talked much about their mother, who stayed behind with their father while the boys ran. He mentioned her once, said she'd been a good person who worked extra shifts to save for their college funds, who volunteered at homeless shelters on weekends, who deserved better than dying alone in a forest while her husband transformed into something that might have killed her or might have just shambled away into the darkness. I didn't have anything useful to say to that, so I just let it sit there between us, acknowledged that the world wasn't fair and never had been, that good people were dying in terrible ways while the rest of us lived with that knowledge and kept moving forward because the alternative was giving up. The psychological toll is harder than the physical survival challenges up here. We have shelter, we have food, we have heat from a wood stove that Mitchell keeps running with deadfall from the surrounding forest. But the isolation wears on you, knowing that most of humanity is dead or transformed, that cities are empty fungal gardens, that the life we had 6 weeks ago is never coming back. Ryan has nightmares most nights, wakes up gasping, and won't talk about what he sees in those dreams. Mitchell has started scratching at his arms compulsively, checking for fungal threads that aren't there, and I've caught him staring at his reflection in the window glass, looking for signs of infection in his own eyes. I'm not immune to it either. The constant low-level anxiety that every cough might be the beginning of colonization, that every moment of dizziness or disorientation could mean spores found a way past my respiratory protection. I've been broadcasting for 39 days straight now, talking to whoever's listening, documenting everything I see and learn. And sometimes I wonder if I'm doing it to help other survivors or just to convince myself I'm still human, still capable of something beyond animal survival. The act of communication feels important in a way I can't fully articulate, like as long as we're talking to each other, sharing information and stories, we're maintaining connection to what we used to be. Colton radioed yesterday with coordinates for a supply cache being established by the Cheyenne Command. Said if we could reach a specific location near Bend, they'd arranged for an airdrop that would include medical supplies, winter gear, and preserved food. The drop is scheduled for day 47, 3 days from now, and it would require us leaving the tower and traveling about 60 miles through terrain we haven't scouted. Ryan thinks it's worth the risk because our current supplies won't last through January. Mitchell thinks we should stay put and extend our rations as far as possible rather than expose ourselves to whatever's moving in the lowlands. I'm leaning toward going because remaining static feels like waiting to die slowly instead of taking action, and I'd rather fail trying something than succeed at doing nothing. The infected we've mapped around the tower haven't moved in 2 weeks, frozen in place by sustained below freezing temperatures, but they're not dead. I watched one of them yesterday through binoculars, zoomed in close enough to see the fungal growth still present under the snow accumulation, still viable, waiting for conditions to improve. When spring comes and the snow melts, these dormant hosts will resume activity, will start moving again, and we'll need to be somewhere else before that happens. This tower is a winter refuge, but it's not sustainable long term. We need to connect with larger survivor communities, need to be part of something more organized than 3 people broadcasting into the void. This is day 44, and we're preparing to make the supply run, packing gear, planning our route, accepting that movement means risk, but stagnation means certain death. Mitchell found a camping supply store on our map that we'll hit along the way. Ryan wants to check a pharmacy for medications, and I need to locate better broadcasting equipment if I'm going to maintain contact with the wider survivor network. We're leaving tomorrow at dawn, driving as far as roads allow, then proceeding on foot through terrain that's probably crawling with dormant infected under the snow. The temperature is supposed to hold in the low 20s for the next week, which means the fungus stays inactive, which means this is our window. Ryan asked what we do if we encounter other survivors who aren't friendly, people like the ones who ambushed that convoy Carter told me about. And I said we avoid conflict if possible, defend ourselves if necessary, and try to remember that desperation makes people dangerous but doesn't make them evil. Mitchell suggested we should just avoid people entirely, stick to wilderness routes, and I had to explain that isolation will kill us as surely as infection, that humans are social animals who need community to maintain psychological health, that the only way forward is building connections with others, even though that means risk. He didn't look convinced, but he nodded, started checking over the hunting rifle we found in the Tower Ranger Station, making sure it was loaded and functional. I'm signing off for now, conserving battery power, preparing for tomorrow's journey. The sun is setting over Crater Lake, and the view is beautiful in that heartbreaking way that reminds you the planet doesn't care about human extinction, that nature will continue with or without us. The fungus is just another organism seeking to reproduce and spread, no more evil than a tree or a flower, and the fact that it's destroying us is just biology doing what biology does. We're not the protagonists in some cosmic story. We're just another species that thrived for a while and might not survive the next phase of planetary evolution. But I'm not ready to accept extinction yet. Not while there are people like Colton working to understand this thing. Not while there are communities forming in the mountains. Not while Ryan and Mitchell are still breathing and trying and refusing to give up. Tomorrow we move, we risk, we keep fighting, because that's what humans do when faced with impossible odds. This is Ethan Calloway, still transmitting, still hoping someone out there needs to hear this. This is Ethan Calloway broadcasting from an emergency shelter 17 miles northwest of Bend, and I need to tell you about the last 7 days because they changed everything for us. We left the tower on day 45 just after dawn, temperature holding at 19 degrees, snow packed hard enough to drive on for the first few miles before the roads became impassable and we had to continue on foot. The silence in the forest was absolute, nothing moving except us and the wind pushing through frozen branches. And every dormant infected we passed looked like someone's idea of a nightmare sculpture garden. We marked their positions on Mitchell's map, counted 43 bodies in various stages of fungal transformation within the first 5 miles, all of them locked in place by the cold, waiting for spring that's still months away. The camping supply store Ryan wanted to hit was a complete loss. Someone had already looted everything useful, left the place trashed with gear scattered across the floor and broken glass everywhere. But the pharmacy 2 blocks away was mostly intact. Looked like people had grabbed obvious medications and missed the important stuff hidden in back storage. We found antibiotics, antihistamines, pain medications, wound care supplies, loaded everything we could carry into our packs, while Mitchell kept watch at the front entrance with the rifle across his knees. He spotted movement across the street, pointed it out without saying anything, and we watched an infected stumble along the sidewalk, moving maybe one step every 10 seconds, so cold slowed it was barely mobile. We left before it could get close enough to be a problem. Day 46, we made contact with a survivor group that wasn't on any of the radio networks I'd been monitoring. They had a camp set up in a hydroelectric facility about 8 miles from our position, using the river flow to generate power, and their broadcast signal was weak but clear enough to pick up once we got close. The voice belonged to someone named Hunter Carver, and he explained they had 18 people sheltering there, working on establishing something permanent instead of just surviving winter. He gave us directions and an invitation, said they needed people with practical skills, and I figured we'd at least check it out before committing to anything. The facility was impressive in its simplicity. Concrete buildings built into a canyon with the river running through turbines that provided consistent electricity. They'd reinforced the access road gates, set up observation posts on the canyon rim, and organized their space efficiently, with living quarters separate from storage and work areas. Hunter met us at the outer checkpoint wearing actual winter gear instead of scavenged clothes, and his people looked healthier than anyone I'd seen since the outbreak started. They had a functioning kitchen, serving hot meals, sleeping quarters with real beds and heating, and a common area where people gathered to talk and play cards like civilization hadn't collapsed 7 weeks ago. I spent 2 days at the facility interviewing residents and documenting their setup for broadcast. They'd survived by moving fast in those first chaotic days, getting out of population centers before the infection density became overwhelming, and reaching this location when it was still defensible. Their leader was a civil engineer named Victor Hanley, who'd worked on the facility years ago, knew its capabilities and limitations, understood that reliable power was the foundation for everything else. He'd brought his family, recruited people with useful skills, and established protocols that balanced safety with actually living instead of just existing in fear. Victor shared his long-term vision while we sat in his office overlooking the turbine room. He thinks the infection will establish permanent presence across the lowlands, that survivors need to accept we're building new civilization in the spaces the fungus can't dominate. His plan is to maintain this facility through winter, send out scouting parties in spring to map fungal spread patterns, and gradually establish a network of high-elevation settlements connected by seasonal trade routes. He's been in contact with the Cheyenne Command, coordinating with their larger strategic planning, and he believes organized communities can survive indefinitely if they're smart about location and timing. Mitchell asked Victor what happens to all the people still trapped in lowland areas, the survivors hiding in buildings or moving through infected zones without any way to reach mountain safety. Victor's answer was blunt and honest, said most of them are already dead or will be by spring, that rescue operations into fungal zones aren't viable with current resources, that the cold calculation of survival means accepting losses and preserving whoever makes it to defensible positions. It's the same brutal pragmatism Mason practiced at Haven 7, but without the fear-based authoritarianism, just realistic assessment of what's possible given the situation. We left the facility on day 49 to reach the supply drop coordinates Colton had provided. The airdrop came exactly when scheduled, military cargo plane flying low over the designated clearing, and we watched crates drift down on parachutes like some kind of miracle delivery. medical supplies, MREs, winter clothing, ammunition, water purification tablets, and a care package that included handwritten notes from other survivors thanking us for the broadcasts, telling us they'd been listening, that the information we shared had saved their lives or given them hope when they were close to giving up. Ryan read those notes out loud while we sorted supplies, and I watched him process the idea that what we'd been doing mattered to people we'd never meet. Mitchell found a note from someone in Montana thanking us specifically for the temperature data on infected dormancy, said that information helped their community decide to stay instead of attempting a dangerous winter migration. There were a dozen notes total, each one representing a person or group that connected with our broadcasts, and sitting there in the snow reading strangers' gratitude made the last 50 days feel less like random survival and more like participation in something larger. We spent that night at a ski lodge 3 miles from the drop site, found it abandoned but intact, got a fire going in the massive stone fireplace, and ate hot food for the first time in a week. Ryan talked about his plans for college, what he'd wanted to study before the world ended, whether any of that education would matter in whatever comes next. Mitchell admitted he'd been thinking about their parents less frequently, that the memories were fading faster than he expected, and he felt guilty about forgetting, while also relieved that the pain was becoming less sharp. I shared stories about working in radio, about the satisfaction of connecting people through communication, and how that purpose felt more important now than it ever had before. Day 50, we made the decision to return to Victor's facility instead of the tower. The hydroelectric camp offered community, resources, and actual long-term planning instead of isolated survival. Ryan and Mitchell agreed immediately, neither of them wanting to go back to that lonely tower watching the frozen world through binoculars. And I realized I didn't want it either. Broadcasting mattered, but it mattered more if we were part of something sustainable, contributing to a community that might actually survive beyond next winter. We're back at the facility now on day 52, and I'm broadcasting from a proper radio room they've set up with equipment salvaged from multiple sources. My signal reaches further with their power supply. I'm making contact with survivor groups across 6 states, and we're building an actual communication network instead of scattered voices shouting into darkness. Colton checks in daily with research updates. The Cheyenne Command provides strategic information, and individual survivors share local conditions and survival techniques that get distributed through the network. Victor offered us permanent positions here, said Ryan's organizational skills and Mitchell's security awareness were exactly what they needed, asked if I'd coordinate communications for their expanding network. We accepted, not because this place is perfect or guaranteed safe, but because isolation was killing us in ways the infection never could. Humans need community, need purpose beyond simple survival, need to be part of something that might outlast individual lifespans. The infected are still out there, hundreds of thousands or millions of them frozen in place, waiting for spring temperatures that will wake them again. The fungal colonies are still spreading underground even in winter, still transforming soil and consuming organic matter, still establishing permanent presence across territories we'll never reclaim. But up here in the mountains, in facilities like this one, and communities scattered across the Rockies, people are building something that might endure. We're adapting, learning, accepting that the world we knew is gone, and focusing on creating whatever comes next. Mitchell spotted the first signs of new infected yesterday during a perimeter check. Fresh tracks in the snow that terminated at a dormant body, suggesting someone recently infected had wandered this far before the cold stopped them. It's a reminder that the fungus is still active in warmer zones, still consuming anyone who hasn't reached safe elevation, still spreading. But it's also confirmation that our position is secure, that the cold works, that we have time to prepare before spring changes everything again. This is Ethan Calloway signing off from the hydroelectric facility with Ryan and Mitchell beside me, alive and planning for a future that might actually exist. We survived the initial outbreak, survived the chaotic weeks of collapse, survived isolation and fear and the temptation to give up. Now we're building something instead of just running, connecting with others instead of hiding, choosing to be part of humanity's next chapter instead of witnesses to its extinction. If you're listening to this broadcast, if you made it through the last 7 weeks, find high ground, find cold, find other people, and hold on to them. Winter bought us time, but spring is coming eventually, and when it does, we'll need each other more than ever. Stay human, stay connected, and keep fighting, because that's all we've ever really had.